Okay, thanks very much for the intro, Hilary, and thanks to Simon and the rest of the Manchester Salon for inviting me to the marvels of the Northern Powerhouse. And so I'm looking forward to exchanging notes with you all about what works and what doesn't work economically, because although I'm up from London, I can assure you that the Southern Powerhouse isn't as powerful or as strong as it's made out to be. Just like up here, it's as much poor house as powerhouse. The election then, well, okay, already affected us. Kirsty's not here. The election is clearly an important focus for tonight. I think the election will be about, no surprise, and I think it should be about. Primarily, the focus should be Brexit. I think it should be about what it's called for, which is to turn the mandate which was given in the referendum into an election mandate. That's what will be about, an election mandate for a clean Brexit. But I would argue that we shouldn't let that primary focus be an excuse for politicians to duck other important issues, because this is still a general election. It's a mandate for perhaps 5 years if they stick to it. So there's a lot of things which should also be discussed. And in that sense, I think the election campaign should be as much not just about the action of leaving the European Union, which people voted for last June, but also should address the spirit of that vote last June, which I think was a spirit of wanting to see things done differently. I think it was a spirit about upsetting the status quo. I think that was the common message there. And that spirit, I think, is the right one to approach what's going to be my topic tonight, which is what type of economic industrial policy do we need? Now, by her words anyway, and you'll probably gather I'm not from what I say, I'm not a great Tory fan, but by her words anyway, Theresa May seems to recognise that spirit of wanting to see things done differently. There's just been, last 3 months, a green paper, which some of you may have come across, on industrial policy. The consultation period just closed, just the day before the election was called, in fact. And in the foreword to that green paper on a modern industrial policy, Theresa May explained that she felt the referendum was not simply a vote to leave the European Union. It was an instruction, she said, to the government to change the way the country works. And her elevation of industrial policy is, she said, part of her answer to that. Because you may know one of her first acts when she took over as Prime Minister was to rename the business department, from being the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills into the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Quite a significant sort of nominal change, because industrial strategy 2015, even 10 years ago, was not talked about very openly as something to emulate, but that's changed particularly since the financial crash. Anyway, in the same spirit of wanting to put industrial policy at the forefront, her ministers, particularly her Chancellor, Philip Hammond, herself, Greg Clark, who you may know as the Business Secretary, they have all emphasised, much more than their predecessors did, much more than Cameron or Osborne did, that this new industrial economic policy should be about dealing with productivity, doing something about the productivity stagnation which has been going on. That means, when you talk about productivity, it means driving up the amount of goods and services which we are able to produce for the same effort, usually measured as what we can produce in an hour or something. And they focused in on productivity as being the problem, which is a very justified focus, because you're probably well aware that productivity in this country, and productivity problem isn't specific to Britain, not specific to the Northern Powerhouse either, but it's common across the mature industrial countries that productivity has been pretty weak the last few decades, but particularly so in Britain. Because you may know, if you follow any of the economic reports recently, productivity level, what we produce, is pretty much the same as it was in 2008 still. It's barely changed. So we've had really a lost decade of productivity growth. And that matters, because without productivity, we're not able to increase incomes, we're not able to increase our living standards. It's that important. So in that sense, that focus from the government, that recognition that economic policy needs to be looked at afresh, and that productivity should be a central part of that, those are, good first steps, shall we say. But I'll be arguing that so far, I think that rhetoric from Theresa May and others has yet to be manifest, or has yet to be presented in a fresh approach to that policy, and that's what I think we do need. If you were to read, I'm not saying you should unless you've got a bit of insomnia like I have, but if you were to read the Green Paper in detail, you would see that it is pretty bereft of new ideas. And that's not just from me, many other people, many other business organizations have said, it's a bit of a repetition of what's been said before. What you'll see in there is little more than a sort of a commentary on the familiar wish list of things like more research and development, which obviously is good, a focus on particular high-tech sectors like driverless cars, artificial intelligence, easier funding for startups, modernized infrastructure, better transport links and so on, and more relevant skills training, which I imagine we'll discuss a bit more during the rest of the evening. Now, we've had that sort of familiar list, not just of pledges, but of activities for a very long time. It's nothing much new within there, and I'm not knocking any of those things, but I am questioning the context in which they're being put forward, because that package of measures is pretty much what we saw from not just Cameron and Osborne before, because in fact Cameron, they did begin to talk about industrial policy even before they departed the front bench. But we saw it within the coalition government. You may remember Vince Cable back in the news again. He's standing again. He was the business secretary who made quite a bit about that, more research and development, more skills training, and so on. But also, and I don't want to go into the history a lot here, but also it really goes back to the new Labour governments, and it goes back even to the Tory governments of Thatcher and Major, where you had all those list of things being acted upon. They are not new things. And while none of them in their own terms is necessarily a problem, their objectives are good, I think, and definitely we need a lot more of some of them, which will probably come up in the discussion, but their very familiarity of that sort of approach to industrial policy, I think poses a big paradox for us. Because if we've had all these things for the last 30 years, and yet we've got productivity stagnation, clearly there is something not working there, and that's what I want to look at in my introductory comments. Now, I think the solution to the paradox of why you have all these good-sounding and, objectively in their own terms important measures, but productivity stagnation coexisting with that, is that governments are not just not doing enough of the good things, the things I've just listed, but they're also doing too much of the wrong things. And that's what I want to focus on. And it's these wrong policies, these wrong things, which are dooming the right things to being mostly ineffective. So what I'm saying is you could even double or quadruple the amount of research and development spending, which is something I would argue for, but that in itself is not going to crack the productivity problem, because there is this, I think, more underlying barrier facing us at the moment. What I'm arguing is that too many government policies have been exacerbating an important barrier both to existing businesses transforming themselves with investment and new technologies, but also a barrier to new businesses setting up and new sectors being created. And that's what is really crucial, I think, for the future, for being able to create the sort of jobs that we need. And this manifests itself not as an absolute failure of innovation or for technology to change, because you only have to look at every newspaper. Every day we can read about some new technology, whether it's to do with some new application for our phones or some new trial of driverless cars or something new in machine learning. I mean, there are technological changes happening. The problem is that too few of those technologies, too few of those innovations are spreading across the economy. They're not diffusing, is the term the economists use. There's a small number of companies which are doing these innovations, not as much as they should be, I don't think, but they are separated from the rest of the economy. And that is the block which is preventing that technological possibilities, which we read and see all around us, being translated into sustainable productivity growth. You see, productivity growth is so weak, I would argue, because it comes from two main areas, just to summarize. It does come initially from a few companies, a few what they call frontier companies, the Apples, the Googles, locally in Britain, the Dysons, the Jaguar Land Rovers. There are a few companies which are innovating, which are making those changes. But that only represents a small part of what gets translated into the productivity growth which sustains our wages and gives us the possibility of living standards. What is much more important to say is that spread, that diffusion across the rest of the economy. And that diffusion machine has not been working well. It's not been working well because of what I would describe, what others describe, as a fall in business dynamism. And what that means is the process by which businesses start up, expand, and then go on to perhaps contract and decline and then exit. That whole process, some people talk about it as business turnover, not in the sense of what the revenues of a business are, but the churn within businesses. New businesses replacing old businesses. And that dynamism has not been working well for some time, really going back to the beginning of the 90s, and there are signs of it in the 1980s as well. And what that means is that we have too many weak businesses, what I call zombie businesses in my book, and other people use the same term, too many zombie businesses which are too weak to invest themselves in the new technologies. They don't have the funds to do that, but they've been able to survive. They've been able to keep going, either through income from some means or by borrowing, because interest rates are very low and so on. So there are too many of these zombie businesses which are congesting the economy and holding the rest of the economy back. Because this doesn't just mean that there are fewer weak, low productivity companies exiting, and therefore no space for the new productivity, new higher productivity firms to grow. But it also has a sort of dampening effect on even the most viable, strong economies as well. Because the zombie businesses underpin. You give me a.
I'm just giving you
a look. Right. The zombie businesses underpin a wider zombie economy of a lack of investment. When you have a low growth economy, it's something which is in a sense self-fulfilling, because if you've got the rest of the economy, wages stagnant, the rest of the economy not spending much, then even the most dynamic countries get caught up, companies get caught up in that, and they don't have the incentives to do as much innovation and as much investment and as much growth as they should be doing. So it spreads across the whole economy and has that dampening effect to further restrict productivity growth. Now, the important point about this zombie economy is that it is not a spontaneous process. There are spontaneous self-generating aspects to it, but it is primarily, I'd argue, the product of state policies, because state policies have been keeping these low productivity businesses afloat, especially since the political changes, which I would situate round about the second half of the 1980s. I think the application of many aspects of government policy, regulations, public spending, public procurement policies, very, very easy monetary policies from the central banks, changes also we can discuss in the insolvency regimes to make it easier for companies to survive. A whole panoply of policies and more have been underpinning the incumbent businesses, both big and small. They've been helping these businesses, both the few high productivity ones, but more importantly for us, the plethora of low productivity ones. They've been helping them to survive. And although that wasn't the intention of government, the intention of these policies, the consequence has been to bring about today's rather sclerotic low productivity economy. Now, the good thing about identifying that the zombie economy, which is this great barrier, I think, to productivity growth, the good thing about identifying that it's policy-induced is that we can do something about it. We don't have to perpetuate those same productivity-impairing policies. We can actually stop those government policies. And that would be the focus, I would argue, of what would be a different, distinctive, upsetting industrial strategy for us today. I mean, to take one example, just before I conclude, an example which I've already alluded to, which is monetary policy. And it's not a unique point I'm making, but when you have emergency interest rates of now a quarter of a percent, and that follows through to sort of interest rates that companies have to pay, then it underpins this whole artificial debt economy whereby not only can we continue to spend, which is obviously we'd say a good thing, but it's an artificial thing because we're spending off the future. But for the focus of what I'm talking about tonight, it underpins a lot of these zombie businesses who have very little to pay in terms of interest rates on their debts that they have, and also because of the ease of monetary policy can borrow more to keep themselves afloat. And it sounds like, oh, well, that's good, means companies keep going and so on, but it's at the detriment of clearing the space to be able to create the sort of new businesses and the new sectors which we need to give us not just any old job which is in decline, but to give us jobs which can give high value and higher wages for us in the future. And that's the sort of thing which I think has to be changed. Final point is that clearly, as I see a few of you looking a bit anxious about this, my argument to sort of reintroduce, as the book says, creative destruction, to have that level of change and disruption in order to create something new. Clearly, that sort of way of recasting economic policy is not going to be painless. And therefore, I would argue strongly that alongside this clearing out of old, low productive businesses, we need also, in order to get to higher levels of dynamism, comprehensive measures to assist people, to assist us, in the transition from the old decaying economy to the new one. And that applies to financial assistance, not on a sort of long-term welfare dependency level, but to help people to move from old jobs to the new ones. And it'll need retraining, which I'm sure we'll look at, because these new jobs, which we don't know all of them are going to be, but those new jobs which can be created will probably need new skills as well. So that's a responsibility of government as well, not just to unleash creative destructive again, but to provide the transitional measures needed to help people to move from low productivity jobs to better ones. And I think including this sort of transformative approach to industrial policy in the election manifestos, I would argue, would be very much in that spirit of the referendum last year, a spirit of upsetting things and looking at doing things differently. And in particular, what I'd argue and what I'm arguing in the meetings I'm having on the book is that it could help to kickstart a national conversation which will address the fact that we do need to make changes. We do need to do a counterintuitive thing, which is to see that the precondition for an economic renaissance, for revival of productivity, is actually to let the old economy go in order to create space for the new one.
Everything you say about, we need to get rid of a lot of these zombie companies makes a lot of sense to me. But it's hard to see how that doesn't mean getting rid of a lot of zombie families and individuals as well. So, you raise interest rates to sensible levels, there's going to be a lot of people who can't pay their mortgage. There's also lots of individuals. Like, for example, I was with a printing company this morning, one of our clients. Printing is finished, right? They're clinging on and they need to go. But this is a family business that's been existed for like 250 years. To tell them, forget it, just throw the towel in, is kind of really tough love, really, isn't it? So, how do you marry those ideas that you have, which sound very sensible and, economically straight talking, with a kind of need to run a society where you're not just throwing people on the scrap heap, but, very, in a very uncaring way, really. Maybe start with that one.
Yeah. Because I think the important thing is that the changes which I'm articulating can't be imposed from top down, because although my book is about the economy, it's really a book about changing the way we look at the world and changing who's involved in making those economic decisions. Because I ended by saying, we need a national conversation, which is an easy thing to say, but I genuinely believe that it's not going to be possible to make the sort of a turnover, the shake-up of the economy which I'm talking about, unless people are involved in that and can understand why. Because I think if it is just something which is imposed, even if you gave the example of, I think, steel workers or whatever, and we see it today, there's discussions of like coal workers in America and so on. If you take those, or the print company that you're talking about, if it is simply imposed saying, your jobs are gone, you're all on the scrap heap, then clearly people will, quite rightly, I would have found that situation, fight against that and fight to resist that. But if it's explained that those are not jobs which can actually ensure that we have a decent standard of living for ourselves and for our children, that simply hanging on to those coal jobs which are unprofitable, or those steel jobs which are unprofitable, or those print jobs which cannot generate enough to keep that family business going in the future. If we can explain that what we've got at the moment isn't the stability of sustainable status quo, but is a stability which leads to eventually to stagnation. It's a stability of stasis and stagnation and decay. that having that discussion, saying we're not in a world in which we can simply say freeze everything. Okay, we've just about got enough to live on. We can just about pay our mortgage. We're, as Theresa May said, just about managing. If we just freeze all that and say, well, okay, life's not too bad, we can get going. My argument is actually we're in a state of decay. If you look at living standards are not for everybody static. Some are even going backwards. I mean, the average income in Britain at the moment, and it may affect your experience or it may not, but the average amount that people are getting is still 6, 7, 8% below what it was in 2008. Now that's an average, and averages can be misleading. But the reality is that people are not moving forwards, and a lot of people are moving backwards. If you look at that, people talk about a 40-30-30 sort of society in terms of what people do. 40% are in decent jobs, 30% are in insecure temporary type jobs, and 30% are not working. Now that hasn't changed all that much. Actually, the middle level has actually gone up, and the people unemployed and the people in the secure situation have gone up a little bit. Have gone down a little bit. But that middle third, which is now about 32%, the latest, of insecure jobs, are not jobs that people love having, and that is growing as a section of society. A lot of the growth in employment, where we're told in Britain we have this full employment society, isn't it great? The economy can't be that bad. Unemployment is less than 5%, things are good. But look at the quality of the jobs which have been created in the last 10 years that make up that full employment, and it is predominantly insecure part-time jobs. So this phenomenon people are talking about, which is called sort of underemployment. We used to focus, or a lot of us used to focus on unemployment as being the symptom of an economy not working. Now, people, I think, are looking at underemployment, which is people who've got a job but want to work in a different way or for more hours. Either they're working part-time and they want to work full-time, they're working self-employed with uncertain hours, people know about 0-hour contracts, and they want to be in a permanent job. And that is now, I think, getting on for 1 in 10 people at work. I think it's 8.6% the last time. That underemployment. So if you add that to the other unemployed, actually there's about 15% of the population are in one of those two categories. Now that wasn't there 20 years ago. So already you're seeing not a perpetuation of the status quo, you're already seeing in pockets of society decay. And I think that's what the discussion we have to have, and saying we can't just hang on to barely managing as it at the moment. This economy is going downwards, and therefore we've got to ourselves take responsibility for doing something about it. So it's a matter of trading off the prospect, the possibility of decent, well-paying jobs in the future if we let these unproductive, unstable, insecure jobs go. And the insecurity applies to not just people who've formerly got an insecure contract, but the family businesses that are just about managing, because they will just about manage until they go under. Take the initiative is what I'm arguing for. Take the lead on this in order to create something rather than let everything just dissipate and decay. I mean, a lot of the questions that we raised are ones which I had in writing this book, because it makes sense. I'll just deal with the sort of the ones here about the new sectors and what you were saying, because I mean, what you're describing is what a competitive economy should work, and it should be. If you're ahead of the game and you're a high productivity company and everyone else is rubbish, it should be a good situation to be in. But you should be able to take advantage of that. But if you look at the experience of Japan, which is where the whole idea of a zombie economy came from, it illustrated that has broken down, that process of a competitive interrelationship between a space opening up for companies to expand, that it got blocked. It didn't work. And you have this thing called a bifurcation or a dispersion across the economy between a small number of high productivity companies. People make different estimates of it, but say 5%, who are able to cope pretty well, make good profits, cash rich, don't have to worry about the bank so much. They can, if they need a bit of extra money, they can go to the markets and get it. Counterposed to the other 95%, which are just about surviving. And that sort of level of divergence, productivity divergence, is a new thing. So, and it's there in America, it's there in Japan, it's there in Britain. I mean, figures, the Bank of England Andy Haldane did a study or pulled together a study, I think, of 30,000 companies. He's, Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the Bank of England. And he looked at a database of 30,000 and produced the same dispersion and showed that actually until you get up to about the 90th percentile of businesses in productivity terms, and you looked at the last 15 years, productivity has been flat. They haven't moved at all, whereas you have this top 5% who've shot ahead. Why is that? That's the question that people are grappling with. Why is there this corporate inequality? Why is this diversion happening? And my argument is that it is the sustaining of those 90%, which is the dominant influence on the rest of the economy. And when you have those businesses continuing, and low wages or low interest rates, I'll come back to the low interest rate thing, they are able to sustain businesses. There's arguments also, very clear arguments, that banks, you say banks aren't being very helpful. Actually, counterintuitive to what you're saying, and we can have a more of a discussion about your specific point, but banks have been not pulling in on poor loans because interest rates are so low. It's called bank forbearance, that the banks have not been pulling the loans on those which are in difficulty, which is, again, another factor. It's not all part of some big plan that somebody up there has worked out to let's keep businesses going, but a multiple of practices which have emerged over the last 15, 20 years from low wage economy, from low interest rates, from bank forbearance, from changes, as I say, in the insolvency laws which have prioritized rescue over liquidation. All these things mean that this 90% is able to keep going, or 95% are able to keep going. And that means, it means people are off the labour market within these jobs, so it's a resource which is kept out. Funds obviously are kept out, land is kept out, space is kept out, and it is clogging up the economy. It's what I call congestion, and it's a bit like traffic congestion. You can have a high performance car, you can have your Ferrari, but if there's traffic congestion, all the cars are only moving at an average of 4 miles an hour. It doesn't matter how powerful a car you've got, you're still stuck in that. And that metaphor applies, I think, to the economy. Even the best businesses find that their markets aren't growing very much because other individuals and businesses are not spending a lot. They're just sort of spending enough to keep themselves going. So there's not a market for those companies, for those stronger companies. The markets which do exist are pretty narrow. I mean, if you look at, take Apple, generally regarded as the most innovative company in the world at one point. Apple, hasn't really done much since the iPhone, right? I mean, it did the iMac, which was a great innovation in terms of personal computers. It did the iPod, which was a great, big step up from the Sony Walkman that we remember from, or some of us remember from our youth and so on. And then it did the iPhone, which is 10 years ago, something like that. Even the most innovative company in the world, all it comes up with is, we're going to have iPhone 8. Is it iPhone 8 now, something like that? It's iterative. It's incremental innovation. So even the most innovative companies in the world are, I think, caught by that congestion of the sclerosis of that other 90%. It also, adds to, I think, what you're talking about, Mindy, which is the risk aversion and the culture of not wanting to change things. That caution that you talked about. You talked about the caution of small businesses not taking on services, but that applies to the big businesses as well. There's a big discussion at the moment about incrementalism in Silicon Valley, not just Apple, but all these companies, which obviously Silicon Valley, just as Apple is seen as the most innovative company in the world, Silicon Valley is seen as the most innovative hub in the world. But actually looking at what's coming out of there, people are saying you're not solving, and these are for people inside Silicon Valley, saying we're not solving the big problems of world hunger and the environmental needs and how to mass produce housing and stuff. We're not dealing with the big questions anymore. We're just bringing out the latest version of the personal gadget. Now,
they never did the big questions. They did things. They never did that. They weren't set up.
All right, so we have a problem there, I'm saying it's a problem that you have this coexistence of a lot of great minds who can come up with things. I think machine learning and the idea of taking beyond mechanization to machine learning, I think is a great potential, but it's so damn slow is my argument about it. If you take robotics, I think that's great the way you shoot robotics. When was the first robot in a factory? 1961, General Motors, right? And it was an arm with a programmed arm to help build cars. It hasn't really changed much in the last 50 years. They're adding a little bit more smartness to it now, but it's the slowness of this. And you know, I have focused in on the zombie economy as an objective feature, but the more I looked at it, the more this reflected a cultural problem which Minnie talked about, which is that aversion to taking the initiative to make too much change. And the only exception to that, which is why I call what's going on not just a long depression, which I do in the book, but it's like a gilded depression. Gilded as in you have this layer of good things happening, the sort of things that, you know, we who've been involved in the IT sector have been part of. But it's just a bit of guilt on top because the rest of the economy has not changed all that much. You know, we have the personal gadgets, we have the smartphones, we have the internet, we have great new means of communication, which I wouldn't have dreamt of in the 1960s. You know, I couldn't have dreamt of that sort of thing. We have that, but it's narrowly confined to the area of communications and computerization and, well, basically that's it, you know, and which then translates into things like e-commerce and so on. But it's a very narrow area. If you think about, I'll finish here, but if you think about the houses we live in, or even the cars that we drive at the moment, or the clothes that we wear, or the food that we eat, it's pretty much the same as it was with a few tweaks to where it was 40, 50 years ago. In fact, we're in a situation now, just last example, for the first time in human history, we are crossing the Atlantic slower now than we ever have done, yeah? Because we went backwards, yeah? We had Concorde until 2003, you had supersonic flight, and now we don't have that. In fact, you know, long-distance air travel generally, it's slower than it was in the 1950s. It's weird. We're going backwards, not going forwards. And that's, you know, I think a culture of aversion to actually taking the initiative to change things. A lot of people have sort of brought together, you know, the people side of things and sort of kind of pose it to the business side of things. And I do think the two things are quite linked. So when you asked the question, just to focus on that, was there ever a time that people were involved in that sort of national conversation? Well, I'd say yes, but in a different way. And in each historical experience, it's being channeled in a particular way. But I think something qualitatively different has happened since around the 1980s. I think that until then, you did have at least competing political visions, which people to some extent were engaged with. You know, people identified with a different political vision as to how society should move forward, which had an economic component to it. I mean, broadly speaking, you had different labels for them, but you had a left-wing point of view and a right-wing point of view in many advanced industrial economies. And often that got converted into a greater or lesser role for the state, which I think was a very narrow way of that discussion happening. But it also reflected, I think, broadly, a view between a more progressive perspective, i.e. one which wanted to take society further forward. That's what I see as the essence of the left-wing point of view, not the level of state intervention or state support that you required or otherwise, but that we could actually build a better future, as opposed to the conservative point of view, which generally promoted the benefits of tradition and the existing culture and the way things were, and promoted openly preserving the status quo. And that clash between a progressive and a conservative point of view and different political labels, I think reflected people being involved in the future of society in different ways, and either taking the view that we've gone as far as we can and that more change is troublesome and more change is too dangerous, and those who said, no, let's take a risk, let's have a bit of ambition, and let's try and move things forward. And broadly speaking, I think the 200 years or so from the early 19th century through to the 1960s, the side that was in control was that which wanted to take society further forward. May not always have meant that you had a social democratic or a socialist or a Labour Party in government, but the idea that we embraced change was something which was broadly accepted, and people went along with that. Now, even in those conditions, obviously change was troublesome, was painful. You know, we know about, you know, the Luddites or the Luddite movement, but, you know, people who were at the sharp end whenever change happened, whenever, say, mechanization came in, quite rightly, wanted to look after their interests. But actually, if you look back at, the specifics of the Luddite movement, they weren't anti-technology. They were anti the way the technology was being used to just throw them onto the scrap heap. They were anti the way the employers were using that technology. Overall, though, people embraced the change in the sense of not that they wanted to destroy their businesses, but people saw that change was part of, it was a good part of life. If we'd had the same mentality, the same risk aversion, the same cultural affinity to the status quo today as they had in the early 19th century, where would we be? If we didn't have mechanization, if we didn't have, steam engines, if we didn't embrace the railway, all those inventions of the first revolution or the second industrial revolution or the third industrial revolution, if we hadn't seen those, disruptive as they were, as being a necessary part of building a better life, then, we would have not got to where we are today. And I'm saying that loose, informal engagement by people in that process has been reached a bit of a barrier in the 1980s, whenever the old political context for those discussions were exhausted. So right-wing politics and left-wing politics both came to an end, really, and it was replaced by this sort of third way type politics. A bit of, we all rely on the market's fine, but it needs a bit of help from the state every so often because there's market failures. This sort of a mixed economy in a new form has taken over, and as part of that, I'll bring my from over, as part of that, I think the economy and economic policy has been taken out of the political arena, taken out of political terrain. Everyone went with this, if you remember the phrase from Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative, was the way she summed it up. Tina, there is no alternative to the market and pretty much to the way the market is organized today. And that is a very fatalist point of view, because the result, the consequence of Tina's, the outlook that there is no alternative, is that we put up and accept the way things are. And that's what's become dominant, I think. That's sort of fatalist point of view. And that's really what the book is an attack on. The book is saying is, no, we don't have to accept the way things are, but we can't rely on the people in the elite at the moment to change things, because they're very happy with the way things are, really. I mean, they don't wake up in the morning happy saying, great, I'm very happy with society, but they have become part of the technocratic way of managing this, and they accept the way things are. It's not good for us, though, and so the book is an attempt to try to say there is a choice, there is something we can do, there is an alternative. Rather than there is no alternative, there is an alternative, and that means us getting involved in making economic policy again. And that's the sort of conversation I'm trying to engender, that it is something which we can do something about. I can only do a couple of points, really. I mean, I agree entirely with what you say about the America and Britain are not that different. I mean, historical periods, yes, you can say it. You can say that going back to the 19th century, the roles were the other way around, because America was playing the same role that China is now to America, was the role that America was playing to Britain. It was copying the innovations from Britain. So this is just a different period of when the industrial capitalism was at its peak. I think if you look at it today, there are also a lot more similarities than you give credit for. I mean, Mariana Mazzucato, I don't know if you've read any of her work in the entrepreneurial state, but she's looked at, in fact, the distinguishing feature of America, which has been able to flatter this image of America as the entrepreneurial society. She identifies that a lot of the innovations which have happened in America, and you're right in saying they've been coming from there, have been state-funded or state-developed. She looks at all the technologies within the Apple, within the smartphone, and about 90% of those technologies came out of government-funded, particularly DARPA-type initiatives. And I think that's one of the differences with America, in that up until the 1960s, there was much more of a sense of mission in America, which I think added to the inability of the private companies to commercialize. Now that sense of mission, if you look at it on the surface, wasn't a very progressive thing. It was the sense of mission of being the leading hegemonic power in the world, the United States, leading, fighting leading the fight in the Second World War, and then leading the Cold War. But that meant that sense of purpose which existed then, which was we want to remain number one, America, and we want to beat the Ruskies and beat the commies, actually meant that state resources were focused in areas of which the byproduct, which is you created a lot of technologies. I mean, the whole space race, the whole computerization came out of the military complex in the United States.
The internet.
And the internet. I mean, the internet itself was, as you say, a function of APRINET, or a development from APRINET, which is a way in which the American research and university and defense departments collaborated and so on. So, the idea that you have this sort of free market economy there, which is distinct to the rest of the world, scratch the surface a bit, and you can see that a lot of it indicates that the economies of the advanced countries are very state dependent. Now, two things have changed. I think, firstly, that sense of purpose has been lost in America and elsewhere. And I think something like the end of the Cold War as a historical event, marked an end of a period whenever there was that sense of taking society somewhere. And that the sort of exhaustion which that historical event represented, I think, again, has had very similar manifestations on both sides of the Atlantic, and in Japan and in mainland Europe. Now, coming back to your first point, if I can conclude on that, and I'll say a word about Brexit. But I focused on the zombie economy because I think the zombie economy provides an objective manifestation of the cultural problems which we face on both sides of the Atlantic. Because it is an expression, the fact that you have all these, as I say, low productivity, often low wage companies being sustained, that is an expression of that discomfort with making change. That governments aren't doing like they did in America in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and whatever the purpose was, change things. They have got an inclination to try and stabilize things the way they are. And I say it's not some big conscious plan, but I think that cultural discomfort with change has expressed itself in a whole range of policies which manifest themselves in this zombie economy. And the zombie economy then I'm targeting in order to provide a vehicle for challenging that distaste for change. And it's trying to recreate, or what I wanted to do is try and recreate a sense that something is worth fighting for. I mean, one of the, I'm a great fan of Elon Musk, but another guy I'm quite a fan of is Andre Guillaume, who's obviously a local guy in a sense. He's the guy who invented graphene at Manchester University in 2004. And he makes some very similar points, or in fact I quote him in my book, in terms of indicating just how unadventurous and how undynamic innovation has become. And he's a pioneer scientist. And he had this dream, he has a dream of how is it that we could actually re-engineer society to become more purposeful again. And he says what he dreams about is that perhaps we discover there's going to be an asteroid, or there's an asteroid there, which is on collision course to Earth in 50 years' time. He says that would be wonderful, because if you had something like that, it would recreate the sort of focus of a Cold War, but around something which could then focus human ingenuity and all the resources of the state and the private sector to how the hell are we going to stop this asteroid destroying us in 50 years' time. Obviously, it's a metaphor, but he's saying that somehow we've got to recreate that sense of purpose, to give a focus, to galvanize, to move beyond simply the great things. And we can't have a big discussion. I haven't got time to have a discussion about it. I agree there's great things happening in information communication technologies and in artificial intelligence, but it's just so damn slow and so damn narrow is my criticism at the moment. It should be much bigger and much broader in terms of its implications. And we need that sort of sense of purpose in order to recreate somehow that sense of purpose. Now, I don't think it's going to come top down, because I think the people running society at the moment have created a modus operandi where they can just about manage things. I mean, they talk about us just about managing, they can just about manage it. The initiative is not going to come from them, which is why it has to come from below. It has to come from people saying, actually, we're not prepared to put up with the way things are just to continue this forever. And by doing that, I think I agree 100% with what you're saying. The key thing is, how do we engineer a society which is prepared to invest in the future? And that investment in the future is overcoming that cultural distaste for change, that risk aversion, that short-termism, all these things that people have described. That's what we need to be able to break through. On Brexit, you see, my view, coming out from somebody who writes about the economy, I mean, I voted, as you may have picked up from my opening comment, I voted for leaving the European Union on not economic grounds, but on grounds of democracy and sovereignty and ability to take control. And it sort of fits in with my overall thesis that we can make a difference, we can make choices, we can change things. And I think the referendum vote was a manifestation of a lot of people saying, you know, let's not put up with the way things are, let's change things. Economically, I don't think leaving the European Union is going to make much of a difference. It has no determined positive or negative effect. What will matter, what always matters, is what we do domestically to confront the problems of low investment, to confront the problems of lack of skills, to confront the problems of low productivity. 20 years' time, when you look back, you know, the fact whether we've got this particular type of trade deal or that particular type of deal will not be noticeable, I don't think, in the overall flow of things. What will matter in the next 15 years is, do we grasp the nettle of the productivity problem? Do we grasp the nettle of why it is? How do we confront this problem of low investment? And if we don't do that, whether we're in the EU or out of the EU, we're going to continue downhill. And if we do grasp that problem, in the EU, out of the EU, and out of the EU we will be, that will be a very, very marginal secondary question to the fact that we can get productivity going. I haven't had time to deal with your point, but I agree with you. Productivity doesn't measure everything, but it is the general theme of economy of time is, I think, underpinning. You know, productivity statistics can always show, don't measure, you know, the greater leisure time, what we do with our lives. You know, electrification wasn't captured in productivity statistics, and you know, anesthetics wasn't captured in productivity statistics. That's always been a problem of them. But the fundamental thing of economy of time, of being able to do more with less, does, I think, underpin not just material progress, but social progress. And therefore, I think it's the best measure that we've got at the moment as an indicator of innovation. So I say, I don't think Brexit's going to change that way. I think the problem, to conclude, is if Brexit, and that's why I began with it, there's a danger that Brexit, a very, very important political issue, can be used by the politicians as an excuse for not dealing with other problems. You're saying we're going to be tied up for the next 2 years. I don't think we should be tied up for the next 2 years. I think we have to say, get on with it, send the civil servants off, negotiate the best free trade deal you can, but we've got homegrown problems which we've got to address, and let's not allow Brexit to be an excuse for not addressing them.
Okay, can we thank our speakers?